I'd now like to turn to the subject of editorial controls of our so-called news. Many important stories never make it into the public domain because of editorial decisions. Sometimes genuinely good editors may find their hands tied because of the people who employ them and who seek to manipulate the news for their own questionable ends. During the war in Vietnam, for example, many of the stories being submitted by frontline journalists were censored so the world would not find out about the massacres of defenseless civilians being perpetrated in the name of the American people. The most infamous story was, of course, the My Lai massacre, but this story didn't break until more than a year after it happened. Not because no one knew about it until then, but because editors wouldn't publish it. John Pilger wrote the following account of that shameful event. I quote, "For more than a year, a discharged GI, Ron Rittenauer, who had heard about the massacre, tried to interest the American press at home and those based in Saigon, notably Newsweek, without success. Finally, the story was broken, not by any of the 600 accredited correspondents in Vietnam, but by a young freelancer in the United States, Seymour Hersh, who regarded the murder of unarmed civilians by American soldiers as shocking." The story of My Lai was far from exceptional, mild even, compared to the routine atrocities of the American forces, such as the much earlier massacre of civilians at No Gan Ri during the Korean War. Dr. Algie Venema, director of a Canadian hospital near the site of the My Lai massacre, reports that he knew of it at once, but did nothing because it was not at all out of the ordinary. Colonel Orrin Henderson, the highest-ranking officer to have faced court-martial charges for the My Lai massacre, states that every unit of brigade size has its My Lai hidden someplace, though every unit doesn't have a Rittenauer. Note that 600 accredited journalists were working in Vietnam at the time. What were they all doing? What were their editors doing? If every brigade has its My Lai, as Colonel Henderson claimed, why were the 600 not telling the world about it? Why did it take one persistent freelancer thousands of miles away to disclose the truth? Editorial control of the information we receive and the opinions we form is an important issue that warrants a talk in its own right. One small example illustrates the point and is worth considerable reflection. George Monbiot once wrote about one Sir Ray Tyndall, whose company controlled about 230 British newspapers. At the time, Monbiot wrote the following, and I quote, "When the Iraq War began, Tyndall ordered his editors to ensure that nothing appears in your newspapers which attacks the decision to conduct the war." His letter was reproduced in the Totnes Times, with the following comments. "In a brave move, which could easily be seen by some as censoring the news, Sir Ray ordered that once war in Iraq was declared, his newspapers would not carry any more anti-war stories. As editorial manager of 8 of Sir Ray's titles, I am proud to say I totally agree with his decision." Unquote. Much of today's corporate and state control of the media is rather more subtle. Many Western editors would hotly deny being controlled by their employers. They may even seriously believe they are independent-minded people, wholly committed to the ideal of a free press. However, self-censorship is unquestionably routine practice, noticeable in the obvious sameness about mainstream media output. Just think for a minute how often different national TV channels and newspapers lead with exactly the same stories, which, considering the multitude of news options and possibilities available to them hour by hour, is really quite remarkable. So it's almost impossible not to arrive at the conclusion that those employed in the media simply would not get their jobs in the first place or hold on to them unless they were believed to be a safe pair of hands. Recall the routine vetting of BBC posts by intelligence services. Why would this be done, if not to ensure that all employees could be relied upon to conform to the 1%'s requirements? As Lord Reith, the founder and first general manager of the BBC, wrote about his government employees, his employers, I beg your pardon, and I quote, "They know they can trust us not to be really impartial," unquote. No one can fail to notice how all of our mainstream so-called news providers invariably lead with identical stories. Given the millions of news stories that happen every day, together with the millions of different sources of those stories, is that not a remarkable thing? The fact that the front pages of most newspapers are invariably similar, if not identical. And the fact that so-called independent TV news broadcasts are invariably similar, if not identical, to the state-owned BBC. One of the best explanations for the sameness of our news is provided by the exceptional Jonathan Cook, an excellent freelance journalist now based in Palestine. Here he recounts his early days in his tragic, newly adopted homeland. The mirroring by newspapers of each other's news agendas is often attributed to human nature, in the form of the herd instinct or the tendency to follow the pack. In truth, this is the way most reporters work out in the field. They attend press conferences, they chase their celebrities together, they speak to some of the same official spokespeople. I learned this myself the hard way when I moved to Israel to report on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Naively, I assumed that, in line with my vision of the ideal journalist as an investigative reporter, a Woodward or a Bernstein, the reporters who broke the Watergate scandal, that I should be trying to find exclusives, stories no other reporter knew about. After all, most newspapers still include in their motto some variation on the claim to be first with the news. What I discovered, however, was that when I rung up the news desk back in London, the editor would always start by asking me where else the story had been published. Paradoxically, when I said it was an exclusive, I could hear his interest was. Even though he knew I had a great deal of experience, he did not want to take a chance on a story that no one else had reported. On run-of-the-mill stories too, the demand from the news desk was the same. Could I get an official source to confirm my story? It happened even when I'd seen something with my own eyes, and an official source meant an Israeli source. It felt almost as if the Israeli government and army had to give their seal of approval before a story could be published. In fact, more than 95% of the reports filed by Britain's distinguished correspondents in Jerusalem originate in stories that they have seen published either by the world's two main news agencies, Reuters and Associated Press, or in the local Israeli media. Exclusives are almost unheard of. The correspondent's main job is to rewrite the agency copy by adding his own angle, usually a minor matter of emphasis, in the first paragraphs or an addition of a few quotes from an official contact. Media Lens, which in my view is Britain's best media watchdog, reported the following story that further illustrates this very important point. A senior BBC journalist leaked an email from his editor to media analyst David Miller at Strathclyde University. The whistleblower's editor had listed several stories which he described as not that interesting, followed by the comment, dull stories, every one of them, don't you think? These were the stories. 1. The leading anti-drugs judge in Afghanistan has been assassinated. 2. There's been an angry reaction in France following the magazine publication of photos of Taliban fighters displaying trophies they'd stripped from French soldiers killed in an ambush. 3. The authorities in Haiti say the number of those killed in the wake of Tropical Storm Hannah has risen to more than 60. 4. A United Nations report says the world's wealthiest countries are failing to deliver on their promises to boost development aid. The anonymous BBC journalist expressed his feelings. I'm sure once that hurricane gets to Florida, we'll have live coverage of telephone poles falling over. But 60 dead people in Haiti, not that interesting. Clearly operating on a very similar philosophy to Lord Reith's, many of the stories emerging from the Americans' illegal war in Iraq were sanitized before being made public, such as banning from US television screens images of the coffins of American servicemen killed in action. Devices such as filling news programs with trivial material in order to deflect attention from significant news have long been meat and drink to most forms of the media. It seldom serves the purposes of politicians for people to be informed about the real detail of the horrors being perpetrated in their name. Greg Pallast's pithy opinion on the subject of rigorous editorial control in the mainstream media is, the USA, where nothing can be censored. when nothing printed is worth censoring.